This is episode 94 of the Rio Grande Foundation's Tipping Point, New Mexico podcast. I'm Paul Gessing.
And I'm Wally Dringmeister.
I'm president of the Rio Grande Foundation, New Mexico's free market think tank. You can find out more about the foundation at riograndefoundation.org. This and every week we'll be talking to you about public policy issues facing New Mexico. Wally, a lot going on this week in public policy and politics, especially here locally in the Metroplex, the Bernalillo County, Albuquerque area, and at least the most controversial issue, I would say, is the amnesty and asylum seekers, and they're being housed, and now that's going to happen at taxpayer expense to the tune of $250,000. Yeah, and the Rio Grande Foundation does not engage with immigration policy. There's a variety of political opinions on all sides of the issue when it comes to the free market approach. Certainly, our friends at the Cato Institute are much more towards the open borders side of things. You've got more conservative voices at the Heritage Foundation and other conservative groups that are much more skeptical. Of course, the administration currently in the White House is very skeptical of immigration. What we at the Rio Grande Foundation say is that this is a federal issue, and we don't engage on borderline issues, what I would call on immigration and whatnot. It's a very tricky and specific area. We can certainly talk, and we'll talk later on in this episode about federal trade policy, which is much more of a cut and dry issue when it comes to the economy. But what we are talking about today is local public policy, and I was asked specifically about that anti-donation clause issue as the city council passed the $250,000 for asylum seekers. About what does the anti-donation clause say? And unfortunately, the anti-donation clause in New Mexico has been largely eviscerated. It dealt with the railroads. It was put in place because governments across our country, especially here in the West, were handing out free lands and various benefits to railroads to get them to come and run their tracks through various states. And whether that was good policy or not, it certainly outraged enough folks that it wound up in the state constitution of New Mexico and several other states. Now, this is not economic development by any stretch of the imagination, but the specific anti-donation clause, point A, underneath of what the anti-donation clause is all about, is nothing in this section shall be construed to prohibit the state or any county or municipality from making provisions for the care and maintenance of sick and indigent persons. And the key word there is indigent. Now, I am not an attorney, but I don't think it would be a wise use of an attorney's time and resources to go before a New Mexico court and attempt to make the argument that these asylum seekers are anything but indigent persons, and that somehow the anti-donation clause prevents city council from allocating this money. Now, that is not a Rio Grande Foundation endorsement of this policy. In fact, contrary to that, the Rio Grande Foundation opposes the use of $250,000 of our tax money for the benefit of the asylum seekers, not because we oppose immigration into this country, again, but this is not what the taxpayers are getting for their money that they would choose to get. This is not what we are being taxed for. We're being taxed for security, police officers and the like, for transportation, for roads, basic government services. This is not at all a basic government service for the benefit of the citizens of Albuquerque. And I'll remind folks that just over a year ago, the city council of Albuquerque passed a 3/8 cent gross receipts tax increase, allegedly because we were in a fiscal crisis, the city was, and they needed the money. Well, they just had this money, as the mayor says, unencumbered and sitting around, available to be used. And so I'm critiquing Mayor Keller and Mayor Davis and Pat Davis, the city councilor who was behind this effort. But also, I think we, conservative, free market, libertarian, just people who don't care for this particular policy should be held to account as well, because where was that voice, aside from the Rio Grande Foundation, a handful of others, when the city of Albuquerque was voting, the council was voting overwhelmingly to raise taxes? Because if you don't have unencumbered money laying around burning a hole in the pockets of these politicians, you don't have them able to abuse the system and just spread money around. If there's no cost politically to these folks, there's no, we're going to have to cut money from here to put money over there, then it makes things very, very easy for these politicians. And I just wish that we had more folks engaged, and certainly the Rio Grande Foundation tried to get folks engaged at the time on this tax issue. But unfortunately, it only seems like it's the immigration issue that gets the kind of blood boiling and the juices flowing among some folks. They don't account for the fact that politicians will spend your money when they get a hold of it, no matter what purpose that may be for.
Well, and it brings up a couple of interesting points. One, $250,000 out of $1 billion with a B. That's now the range of the city of Albuquerque budget. In the big scheme of things, not that big, but also as that bureaucracy gets so big, it's one of those, the fact that if $250,000 is no longer something that it's even to be trifled with from a fiscal management point of the city, that's disturbing in and of itself. And again, back to just the immigration issue at a top level. Again, certainly not anti-immigration. I think immigration can actually be a wonderful thing for the United States of America if we could put together a policy that would, be rational and help people and to do it legally. But the other is that we see cities, and this is a good example, it's almost like cities in America now need their own foreign policy. And so this is an extension of foreign policy at the city level, seemingly something the federal government, if they were to take care of it, they would be the right one. But no, we have cities doing this, and it is turning into quite a situation. And then the other is we've seen so much crime in Albuquerque, and I certainly am not going to say that this recent $250,000 is going to be what's going to make or break crime, but we have some serious issues here in Albuquerque. And not that the two always play off against each other, but I just have a feeling that the two are somehow related, which is one of the reasons that people are so concerned, and many are up in arms about the policy and the money that the city's spending.
Yeah, one of the things is that what makes this situation so galling is that the mayor and Davis and other politicians are acting like they have the moral high ground here, that they are caring about people, the needy, etc., when they are not really doing anything as individuals to assist the asylees. At least so far as I've heard or seen, these people, these politicians, are simply using the power, the force of government to take money from us, the taxpayers, and then they take credit for spending money that's, what the government is there for, to do the basics, and then they're taking credit for their benevolence and their being caring people. If they were out, feeding meals or housing asylees or paying for living space for these folks, that would be a totally different issue. But they are able, because no one calls them on it, to take the high ground morally and act like they're the ones who are expressing support for these people who, have faced many, many challenges in their home countries and certainly didn't necessarily make the trek to the United States for no good reason. So it's just very frustrating and upsetting that people, politicians, can assume the moral high ground on these issues when all they're doing is voting to take money from the rest of us and give it to another group. They're not actually doing anything directly as individuals. And I would countenance that if folks do care about the people coming here and helping them, that they should volunteer and donate to those organizations. And the same could be said for many, many other issues that government over the years has horned itself in on. We've gotten away from civil society in our nation as a way of doing things, and instead the attitude is, if you care about something, you have to go seek an appropriation from it, whether it's Washington, D.C., and I believe it was the Special Olympics, as I recall, recently, where Trump was trying to cut funding for that, and it's just not a role government should be engaged in. And same for diverting $250,000 to the asylum seekers. It's something that's the proper role of charitable organizations in our society, not government at large. And I just I saw an article on social media that because the facilities at the state fairgrounds are occupied, the 4-H program, it's a livestock school, is being canceled. So there are costs to these kinds of programs and uses of facilities that aren't necessarily being encountered by those of us who don't engage in some of those projects like 4-H. So it is something that's costing some people their hobby, their project that they're engaged with, and that's a real challenge and problem.
Yeah, and just to close out the final thought, a couple things on politicians taking credit for spending our money. I've always advocated naming buildings after politicians well after they're dead, and we see whether the check's clear or not while they're alive. And the mayor and Councilor Davis's position are a little bit similar to me knowing that Paul Gessing has made a series of charitable contributions and me writing those organizations and taking credit for it. So, it's one of those, it is the money of the taxpayers. It's not the politicians.
Yeah, ironically, while we're on the topic of the state fairgrounds, one of the most egregious examples of buildings and things being named after living politicians is the Cheryl Williams Stapleton African American pavilion or building over there on the fairgrounds. And not only is Cheryl Williams Stapleton a horrendous vote in Santa Fe on the issues, but to have something named after not just a living person, which that can cause problems. You never know. I'm sure there were buildings named and things after Bill Cosby at some point around this country. What do you do with that? But Cheryl Williams Stapleton is a sitting legislator, and that is a clear and serious conflict, I think, for people to be in the legislature. Of course, they're going to vote to fund the fairgrounds and anything associated with that because they named the building after them. It's just very, very unfortunate. But we're going to move on to other buildings and other taxes being discussed and in many cases misused. And it was announced this week that voters in the Albuquerque Public Schools jurisdiction, the area that's not limited to the city, but is actually APS, including some of the East Mountains, Corrales, several other places that are not contiguous with the city of Albuquerque, will be voting this November on the city ballot. And that's kind of a switch by itself, is that the city election will be in November, not where it's normally been in October. But they will be coming to the voters for a total of $302 million in revenues. But that will be through renewing a mill levy that's expiring. Mill levy, of course, being property tax revenue coming in. They will not be asking for a tax increase that was on the February ballot. So some victory there for us, for Rio Grande Foundation, for the voters, for property tax payers, because the district, even as I think oblivious and politically unwilling to understand where voters were coming from as APS has been, they at least realized that coming back to the voters for a property tax increase this November was not in the cards.
Yeah, this is the proverbial your property taxes will not rise. The messaging is never your property taxes would have potentially gone down but for this. Way scaled back ask. And given the negative pushback, it will be real interesting to see the mood of the electorate come November, whether this goes through or not. Other than announcing it, I really haven't seen personally, I'm not saying it hasn't happened, but I certainly haven't noticed any massive outreach, the APS folks going out into the business community and the larger community talking about the need for this and explaining it. So we'll see if that comes forward or not. And this will be an interesting one to see through the remainder of 2019.
No doubt about it. And, Rio Grande Foundation is generally pretty skeptical about bond issues. And it's worth noting that the voters were presented with 3 questions in February, 2 of which were tax hikes, 1 of which was a bond. So there would have been no increase in your property taxes had the 3rd one been approved. But voters, I think, rightly were skeptical, high turnout, outrage, and they turned down the bond along with the 2 tax hikes. So APS coming back with just the bond renewal is probably in their own best interest. And Rio Grande Foundation will explain all of the reasons why voters should, demand more efficiency, more appropriate uses of our tax dollars, as opposed to building this massive training center up on Candelaria in Louisiana. Other ways that APS should be more efficient, should be active in lobbying for repeal of Davis-Bacon rules. It's already spending much more money than other districts around the region. A lot of reasons why voters should be concerned and should consider voting no. However, I suspect that the media attention, that the general back and forth on this issue will be significantly less. So we will definitely be engaged and involved in educating the public, but we'll see if the kind of outrage bubbles up. Now, what I think is even more critical, quite honestly, is the management of APS, because now in November, 3 school board members, or at least their districts, 1, 2, and 4, and we don't know who the candidates will be at this point, because one of those school districts is 2. It's my personal district over on the west side where I happen to live. Wally Peggy Muller-Aragon, though, is the current school board member, and she's one of the voices of reason. She opposed what APS was doing in February with the tax increases. The other 2 are currently held by Yolanda Montoya Cordova and Barbara Peterson, who I would call part of the blob, the education blob, the status quo at APS. So districts 1, 2, and 4 of APS are on the ballot this November. And, folks, there's still room for people to run for these boards. There's still opportunities to get engaged in these campaigns. We need good candidates running for Albuquerque Public Schools School Board who will not look to the taxpayer pocketbooks as their first choice when they're trying to stretch resources or spend money. They'll actually think creatively, think about efficiency, allocate resources more carefully. And hopefully if we get some better candidates managing our schools, we'll have better student outcomes at APS, which of course we know APS is deeply challenged, not just in its financial management, but also in student outcomes. So, Wally, when do you make your candidacy known for the Albuquerque Public Schools School Board?
Not this year. We're not this year. Maybe one of these years. So never say never, but not this year at this point.
All right. Sorry to throw you out there.
No problem. Hey, and speaking of efficient management and in education and fiscal management and doing our money, I think that's a fantastic lead in to this next. And with your permission, I'll strike up the band for this theme. So,
absolutely.
All right. For those not familiar, that is Hail, New Mexico, the University of New Mexico fight song, and fighting for a Lobo victory. But next story on the agenda, Paul, the UNM Athletics Department is expecting a budget shortfall. Have we seen that? When's the last time we saw this story? Oh, pretty much every year for the past many.
Exactly. And I'll just give a shout out to somebody we had on the podcast. I'm sure you could go back to the archives, Wally, and find where Daniel Libet of the he used to run a website here that watchdogged literally the Lobos, kind of a play on words there. Thank you very much. But tried to push for some accountability. Now, Rio Grande Foundation's ambitions and our purview is well beyond the New Mexico, University of New Mexico or NMSU athletic departments. But when they're spending $1 million, and that's above and beyond a lot of forced fees that are charged to students, and it's I think very serious whether students should be charged fees for athletic departments for going to school when they don't necessarily have any interest or benefit from those particular athletic programs. But that's not a question we're going to go into here. The athletic department at UNM is about $1 million in the red. They are looking at a couple of options. That is to somehow take a break on payments for the renovations to the pit, the basketball arena from several years ago. That was something that I know Daniel Libet took a lot of interest in, is the renovations to the pit and how that did not necessarily work out well in retrospect. I don't know how that's supposed to work. I don't know who the lender is. I know that you and I, Wally, if we called up our mortgage lender and said, hey, I really am stretched tight this year. Can we just take a break on the payments that we're paying down on our house? Our house is that probably would not be well received by the lenders. I suspect the case may be the same for UNM, but we'll see. And then they are, of course, considering postponing their first payment toward a 10-year deficit reduction plan and getting a waiver for debt service payments according to the university. So they've been, with these deficits being so regular over the years, Wally, and very well covered in the media, thanks again in part to Daniel's great work watchdogging the Lobo athletic program. The athletic program did put together this kind of glide path towards fiscal responsibility for athletics. But first year out of the chute, it looks very likely, and I suspect that the second option, that the one we're talking about right now, is the one that they'll choose, because their lender will probably tell them to take a high jump off of a short bridge, and that's not going to happen. So it's likely that they will, in the very first year of this debt reduction plan, say, no, we can't quite adhere to that plan, which is not a very good precedent, I might add, Wally.
No, not at all. And to hear more about kind of the issues around UNM athletics, Tipping Point, New Mexico, episode 71, Paul, as he mentioned, interviews Daniel Libet, the watchdog group of the UNM athletic department. And yes, I guess what struck me on this is they made such a big deal a few short months ago, the regents and the athletic department, about how this was the plan. The old days of deficits were over, and in fact, we've come up with a plan to pay those back. We're cutting sports, and then just a few months later, we're back in seemingly the same position with a huge deficit. So maybe they're making progress financially, but only from a point of view of potentially a Washington tax and spend and borrow and spend bureaucrat.
No doubt about it. Now, Wally, we're going to do something a little different. And I just got done telling folks about how we typically do not engage in a lot of federal issues, but tariffs and free trade are pretty darn fundamental to free market economics. And while the president, the Trump administration, have done a lot of great work on a lot of different issues, regulations being one of them, energy being another, it has benefited New Mexico tremendously. The Trump administration is raising tariffs on another couple $100 billion worth of Chinese goods, potentially as much as $500 million or half a trillion, I should say, worth of imports. So that's taking the tariff rate to 25%. Very, very fraught issue here, I think, for the global economy and potentially for New Mexico's economy as well. And before I hand it over to you, Wally, the economy nationally has certainly weathered the tariff storm, if you will, very, very well. Unemployment rates extremely low. Things are booming economically. Even New Mexico has seen its unemployment rate drop tremendously during the time Trump has been in office. We've seen strong economic conditions. And to date, it does not appear that many areas, the overall economy has not been overly impacted by Trump's tariff policies. You can certainly point to specific areas of the economy that have suffered, but national economic picture has been very strong. Wally, do you think this latest round, which has spurred some unease in the equities markets, the stock markets, do you think that Trump is taking us out into dangerous economic waters here, or do you think the Chinese will fold and go along with what Trump wants ultimately, and it'll all work out?
Well, my role as an amateur economist and recovering CPA, I've followed issues like this for many years with more interest than normal people have about it. And historically, tariffs were much more widely used in the United States. And, a tariff is just basically something that when you put a tax, it's a tariff, but when you put a government charge on goods that are imported into the country, really the impact of it is it ostensibly hurts the party that is sending the goods into your country, but really the impact has tended to be economically, it hurts the consumers within your country the most of anyone. And back to the Great Depression, tariffs are a mighty dangerous, mighty powerful tool. And the conventional wisdom, which I somewhat buy into, is that China probably has more to lose than the U.S., which is possibly why Trump is taking a harder line than many, many other presidents have taken, at least in my lifetime. And then what I never seem to be able to get good details on is what is the fight in terms of the policy? Who's acting fairly? Who's acting unfairly? There's a whole lot of accusations that are always thrown around. But you're right. The stock market doesn't like this. Trade is very important to the United States, and when you have exports being increasingly important, particularly of petroleum and petroleum products to a state like New Mexico, this sort of tariff thing is hitting a lot closer than it has probably from being important to New Mexico, for sure within my lifetime and probably forever.
Yeah, no doubt about it. And to take that discussion home to New Mexico, of course, we know that New Mexico's economic prosperity is closely tied to oil and, to a lesser extent, at least these days, natural gas. Now, coming full circle on the policy, while it is a national issue, or while they were both national issues, the Rio Grande Foundation took a very strong stance in support of liquefied natural gas, or LNG, which exporting that required some policy hoops to be overcome. And to credit where credit is due, these achievements came during the Obama administration. So Obama can take some credit for the recent boom in LNG exports as well as crude oil exports. So those are both near and dear to New Mexico. And I'm looking at a Reuters story. In 2018, 27 LNG vessels went from the United States to China. That was down from 30 in 2017, but we're way down now, showing that just a couple of LNG vessels went from the United States to China. And certainly there are other countries that would like to access cheap LNG from the United States. In fact, the European Union, just on May 6th, promises to double U.S. LNG imports within 5 years. And it's one of the curious things, Wally, about free trade, is that often these markets grow to be somewhat fungible, where if you can't get your product from X, then Y will export it to you. And then Y is no longer competing with you in the previous market, and you can export it that way. So there tends to be some equilibrium there that can undermine the impact of whether it's tariffs on one country, or in the case of, say, Iran, and not getting into the foreign policy discussion, but in terms of like an embargo or some kind of trade restrictions towards an individual country, if other countries are willing and able to step up to the plate, then you don't have the kind of economic impact, whether it's on the exporter or the importer side of things. It tends to wash out. But it is very important, both issues. Yes, prices are way down for natural gas in New Mexico, but production is way up, not so much in the Four Corners, but just as a derivative product of the oil being produced down in the Permian. Liquefied natural gas in this booming market is a potential cash cow for producers in New Mexico, and ultimately, unfortunately, in some ways, the state of New Mexico and its bottom line, where we're likely to see large surpluses from the oil and gas industry. So that's the natural gas side of things, Wally. And I just want to pause there and give you a chance to engage with what's happening with regard to China on that issue before I move on to the crude oil issue.
Yeah, and you made a point that, and I was thinking, right, you explained it very well, is that if you view supply going into this thing called the market and demand coming out of that, sometimes it is relatively easy to displace where things come from and where they go to if two particular countries within that marketplace are having issues. And again, not to go into too much of the details, but it's not surprising that Europe would like another source of liquefied natural gas, or of natural gas period, given that their primary source tends to be the Russians, who can have and will again use their dominance in supplying energy to Europe as a big stick to get what they want politically and economically. So it is not surprising that that's the case in Europe, and that these markets have a way of adjusting. Not always, as you pointed out, one country to one country might not be able to trade anymore. That doesn't mean that the market can't come to some equilibrium and get to pretty much the same place, despite the best ever efforts of certain governments.
And I want to clarify, I was reading this Reuters story, and I knew I had seen the number, but as of March 12, 2019, only one LNG vessel had left the United States for China. So definitely, given that the last 2 years had seen 27 and 30, respectively, and that as of early March, we were down to one vessel exporting LNG, liquefied natural gas, to China. Pretty strong indicator that trade war is hurting at least that direct export. Of course, other avenues do present themselves, and it seems like the same situation is happening. Of course, exports of crude oil were only legalized in the United States due to the 70s embargo situation and the shocks that we experienced as a country with regard to crude oil and gasoline, of course, at the pump. There had been a restriction placed by the federal government on the export of crude oil out of the United States, and that ban had held in place until Obama's second term. I don't remember the exact year offhand, but I will say that it's the best vote that Michelle Lujan Grisham, our current governor, former congresswoman, took, in my opinion, in her entire time in Congress, when she voted on a standalone bill that would have resulted in crude oil exports being legalized. Obama said that he would veto the bill had it reached his desk, but it was subsequently in the Senate, U.S. Senate, folded into a bigger piece of legislation that Obama did sign. And to his credit, he did sign the legislation, but this legalized crude oil exports. And I'm looking at a chart from the Energy Information Administration, one of the most useful things federal government does, showing crude oil exports, thousands of barrels per day, essentially going from zero, although there were times that you had some crude oil exports being made for various reasons, essentially loopholes in that law, going in a semi-straight line upward to 3,000 barrels per day. And I'm sorry, I don't have the exact translation over to a real number there, but 3,000 is a pretty significant number if you're talking daily. Crude oil exports have been booming as a item of export from the United States. And this is great news, again, not just for the country and its trade balance and the overall U.S. economy, but of course, New Mexico is now the third largest producing state in the entire union. That means that when New Mexico sees more exports happening, that is more money, more jobs, more economic growth for the land of enchantment. And before I get to you, Wally, you look at a different chart, and the same group, the Energy Information Administration, U.S. exports to China of crude oil and petroleum products, and that's thousands of barrels, I believe, a year, but it's actually monthly. So China is one of the places that I know that law was meant to boost our exports of crude oil to China, because they are an energy importing nation, fast growing, of course. And you see a much different situation, whereas you saw a pretty good boost when crude oil exports were legalized. It's been a much bumpier path in terms of China. Now, perhaps, again, China's buying from elsewhere, and those other markets are then in turn buying U.S. crude that they would not buy. They would have bought from some other supplier. But certainly, as this trade war ratchets up with China, it could result in greater harm to not only the United States as a whole, but right here to New Mexicans every day. And that's obviously the oil patch, but certainly we know how dependent our entire state is on the money that comes in from the oil and gas industries.
No, without a doubt. And, I was looking at those Energy Information Administration charts, and basically a 1,000 barrels per day, 2,990,000 barrels per day. Just to put that into context on an annual basis, that would be 42 gallons of in a barrel of oil. That's 45 billion gallons. And another way to put that is, let's say that you use 250 gallons of gasoline. Not that every gallon of oil is gasoline, but that's enough. The amount we're exporting on an annual basis could provide basically 250 gallons of gasoline per year for over 183 million cars. So, we're talking a lot now. Not all oil is used for gasoline. Not all of it's used for cars. Oil is used for lots of things. But in terms of the scale and scope of what these exports have grown into in a very short period of time, it's a very big part of the U.S. export economy. And as you mentioned, New Mexico's role in that, by extension, the New Mexico export economy, because even if our molecules of oil are not exported, if they're exported from somewhere else in the U.S., New Mexico oil would go into that market and be used here domestically, or however that works. It's the beauty of the flows of the market.
It's fungible. Fungible, such a great term.
Yes.
It applies whether you're talking about oil, to a lesser extent natural gas. Oil has been a global market for a long time. Natural gas getting more global. Government spending. It's earlier in the episode we talked about the immigration issue and the fact that by allowing city council, not pressuring them not to raise taxes in March of 2018, those taxes were raised, and then the city council had plenty of money laying around, so to speak, to spend $250,000, and quite honestly, potentially a lot more, depending on the way this whole amnesty and immigration issue shakes itself out over the next several months or even years. I don't see it going away, and I suspect that when $250,000 is spent, that's just an initial down payment on what we're all going to see down the road on asylum seekers and others from the city of Albuquerque, given who is in control. I want to make one last comment before we close out, and that is that we had a great luncheon with Dr. Larry Schweikert on Ronald Reagan, the American presidents. We're on AM 1600, The Rock of Talk, Eddie Aragon and his station. We're on KKOB as well. You might even be able to pull up a podcast, I think, of the Bob Clark Show when Larry was on, Dr. Schweikert. And we will have video coverage available on the Rio Grande Foundation website, so you can check out what Larry Schweikert had to say. We'll post his PowerPoint slides, etc., at the foundation website and heirsofenchantment.com. Nothing but rave reviews from all the folks who attended that particular event, and really thanks to everybody who came out. And hopefully, if you're listening but not attending Rio Grande Foundation events, you'll go ahead and do both, because there's a lot of exciting things happening, a lot of interesting people coming to New Mexico and speaking on the ideas of limited government, and exciting leaders, of course, like President Reagan. So thanks for listening to this week's discussion. We're working every day to turn New Mexico around. Go to RioGrandeFoundation.org for more information or to support our work.